Our first presenter of the day is Dr. Tammy Nemeth, Strategic Energy and ESG and Analyst, to present on a new global language and what it means for livestock producers. Dr. Nemeth, originally from Saskatchewan, is a strategic energy and ESG analyst based in the UK. Her consulting company, ESG Squared Insight, offers research, analysis, and insight to help organizations understand the overlapping challenges of energy, security, geopolitics, and environmental social governance. Dr. Nemeth has a PhD in history from the University of British Columbia and was a guest lecturer of the geopolitics of energy and the environment at the University of Germany. We're happy to have Tammy here today. Tammy's presentation is sponsored by Saskatchewan Livestock Finance Cooperative. Please give Tammy a warm welcome.
Perfect. So I just wanted to thank Garner and Chad and your team for organizing such a great gathering here, and thank you for inviting me to speak to your AGM. And my talk today is going to be Shaping Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And it's absolutely great to be back in my home province. We still have the family farm where my 80-year-old mother-in-law holds down the fort. Our neighbors heard that I'd be speaking to your gathering, and they said, "Cattle people are a lot of fun." And they shared with me this joke, which I thought I'd share with you. So two ranchers met at a cattle conference, and they got to chatting. And the first rancher says, "What's the name of your ranch?" And the second rancher replies, "The XWK Lazy R Double Diamond Circle Q Bar T Ranch." The first rancher nods and asks, "How many cattle do you have?" And the second rancher sighed, "Only a few. Not many survived the branding." So let's get started. On March 13th, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board released for public consultation its proposed draft sustainability and climate-related financial disclosure standards. Wow, that's a mouthful. These standards relate to sustainability, which actually has no agreed-upon operational definition, and climate, where the science is far from certain and specific impacts are actually unknowable. Yet the standards are designed to do nothing less than change our entire economic system. So, although the standards will be applied to 11 sectors and 77 industries, today my presentation is going to outline the key issues for stock growers and what you can do about this going forward. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'll give a refresher of the path to the CSSB. Then I'll briefly discuss the likelihood of it becoming mandatory and the timeline for implementation. Then I'll present what's at issue for stock growers. And then lastly, I'll conclude with some warnings or lessons learned from the oil and gas industry on what to do going forward, because these standards are not the end of the road, they're just the beginning. So currently, companies can voluntarily provide information on their sustainability or environmental, social, and governance record and how it affects their companies. This voluntary information is usually intended for investors. But there's been a movement since 2015 to mandate and embed sustainability and climate reporting within financial disclosures, which would make them legally enforceable. So before you would have a voluntary statement, you wouldn't be liable for what you said in that, but now they want to make it mandatory, linked to your financial statements so that you would be financially liable for whatever it is you said in your statement. Now this has been achieved through the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, which released the first global baseline for sustainability standards last June, which was the focus of my presentation here last year, which I did virtually. So in 2022, Canada created the CSSB to develop and support the adoption of the ISSB sustainability standards. The CSSB has basically just cut and pasted what the international standards are and relabeled them Canadian. So these are the first two of a planned set of at least 5 building blocks that are intended to be interoperable with some jurisdictions around the world, and they're intended for publicly listed companies. The third document here is the industry-based guidance for implementing the climate-related disclosures. Now, some downplay the potential impact of the standards by saying small operators or businesses don't have to worry because the standards are only for publicly listed companies and they'll be voluntary. And it's true that they will be voluntary until they're mandated by the regulators, like the Canadian Securities Administrators and the Saskatchewan Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority and the banking regulators. And however, and this is a key point, non-publicly listed entities may have to comply with elements of the standards because they are part of a larger company's supply chain. Ultimately, the regulators will decide what size of company or who precisely will need to apply the standards. It's also important to note that the banking regulator has also said that it will consider the final CSSB standards for incorporation into mandatory guidance, probably with their B15 guidance, for banks, insurers, and pension funds. And it is very likely that the regulators will make the standards mandatory in the very near future. The chair of the Canadian Securities Administrators announced the day that the standards came out that it would consider the final CSSB standards for incorporation into a CSA rule to become mandatory under Canadian securities legislation. The banking regulator has said something similar. Now, people from the Alberta Securities Commission have said to me and to others that it's really important for people to comment on the standards so that the administrator has a rationale and a basis for reshaping and amending the standards for mandatory use. In fact, they couldn't stress that enough. So the timeline is as follows. Once the comment period is over, which is today, June 10th, the CSSB will consider the comments and finalize the standards by the fourth quarter of 2024. Then the CSA and the various provincial regulators will review them in the first quarter of next year and offer a draft for comment probably in the second quarter of 2025. The comments will be reviewed with a final version released, incorporated into the legislation by the end of next year, with implementation for fiscal year 2026. So that's 18 months away. Okay, so these disclosure standards are likely to be mandatory for 2026. What's in them? It's important to remember, and I'd like to emphasize, that the CSSB disclosure standards are not like traditional accounting. They ask for very subjective material that's open to interpretation, as well as for certain data that's difficult to verify, like all emissions in a value chain, upstream and downstream. And there are several issues with the standards, but what I'm going to do is pull out two of the most important for you. That is the mandatory Scope 3 emissions accounting and the mandatory high baseline water stress reporting for certain industries, which together, with the fact that the US and Mexico aren't really doing this, or at least not to the same extent as Canada, puts Western Canadian stock growers at a competitive disadvantage with our closest competitors. So among many other things, the new CSSB standards mandate the annual reporting of Scope 1 emissions. That's the part in the middle, which means it's anything that a company is directly responsible for. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions from the power or heat, your utility that you use in your operation. And Scope 3 emissions means all 15 categories that they have listed there, and I know it's a little bit difficult to see. And it's everything that can be linked to an entity across the supply chain. So from how the product is transported, how it's used, how it's disposed of after purchase, it looks like all of this has to be reported. And this is how stock growers and agricultural producers are pulled into the reporting, even though they're small or not publicly listed entities. Now, for example, let's say your calves or cattle are sent to a facility run by Cargill or JBS for feeding and processing. They'll likely require you to report on the emissions embedded in that calf or cow. And eventually, all of the emissions from your operation up and down your supply chain will need to be reported, from the fuel you use, to the baler twine, to the feed, to the emissions embedded in the seed you may have planted, the emissions of the fuel for your equipment, and so on. Now, it may be initially, they'll limit the requirement to your Scope 1 and 2 emissions with an estimate of your Scope 3, and maybe some questions about how you plan to reduce those emissions and what sustainability practices your operation has in place or intends to put in place. Now, the standards seem to indicate that data from industry associations will be acceptable. It could be that you will be able to use the emissions number that's been calculated by the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and they've worked really hard on trying to come up with that number. And that could certainly be an option initially, and is a reasonable way to mitigate the onerous and invasive calculations. In the comments process, I know that a number of people have requested that Scope 3 emissions accounting be voluntary rather than mandatory. But you know, with these issues, even if they decide that, the goalposts are always moving. An important point to remember is that these publicly traded companies must set targets for reducing their overall emissions, and every year there's supposed to be improvement. So you may think your operation has a pretty good emissions profile, but it can't stay that way. It must eventually get down to net zero. This means those larger entities will also be looking at ways to annually reduce their emissions profile, since on average between 80 and 90% of their emissions comes from their value chain. The CSSB recognizes the challenge of Scope 3 emissions reporting, but all they did is offer a 2-year relief, meaning that once the standards are mandatory, companies will have 2 years in which to provide Scope 3 emissions accounting. So of particular importance for Western Canada, through the industry-based guidance, there are requirements across 29 industries to disclose the gross percentage of operations that occur in areas of high or extremely high baseline water stress. Almost all oil and gas industries and agribusiness are affected by the water risk data disclosure. But notice on this list here, so too are hotels, restaurants, and home builders. Only a binary question is asked: are the operations in areas of high to extreme high water stress? And where does this information come from? Is it reliable? The industry-based guidance mandates the use of the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas tool. There's actually a disclaimer in one of the Aqueduct tool's explanatory documents, and I've put a number of the quotations here from that document. And it states, Aqueduct remains primarily a prioritization tool and should be augmented by local and regional deep dives. It also says the indicators have limited added value on a local scale. Now, why is this important? The designation of baseline water stress in the industry-based guidance is being presented to investors as if that data has been verified, as if local considerations have been taken into account, and is therefore useful for investors. But the Aqueduct tool was not designed for this purpose. The CSSB standards do not allow for or require discussion or indicators of local, regional, provincial, or national regulations. Not only that, the data does not take into account the soil quality that holds water differently, nor the fact that livestock grazing tends to occur in drier grazing areas that aren't suitable for crop production, and that the livestock is actually essential to maintain the biodiversity and health of the land. So why does this matter to Saskatchewan stock growers? As you can see on this map of the Water Risk Atlas tool, the main agricultural and oil and gas producing areas of southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta, and southern Manitoba are located in high to extremely high baseline water stress regions. That's the really dark red and brownish coloring on the map. The orange is medium high risk, saying that it's almost at that high level. So, for example, a company identified as a meat, poultry, or dairy producer, like Cargill or Maple Leaf or JBS, must disclose the gross percentage of agricultural products sourced from regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. They also must quantify from livestock producers the total water withdrawn and total water consumed in regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. So for the meat, poultry, and dairy industries, there's an additional metric of percentage of contracts with producers located in regions with high or extremely high baseline water stress. It's only absolute numbers and binary choices. This binary choice does not provide adequate and decision-useful information for investors, and actually could undermine investor decision-making, meaning Saskatchewan livestock, because of the Aqueduct tool, could very well be disqualified from purchase by large processors or purchasers that are publicly listed. There's no room for context in this type of information. Investors will probably only look at the absolute numbers. It's a box to tick, and not necessarily on the meaning behind those numbers. And I'd like you to note here on this map that Ontario and Quebec are not in areas of high water stress, which has implications for livestock and dairy production in Western Canada because of the choices that the processors and the investors could make based on this data. Now, for context, in the recent Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef National Assessment, the difference in water depletion between Western regions and Eastern Canadian regions is stark. In 2021, it is 762 liters per kilogram for live weight in Western regions compared to 90 liters per kilogram for live weight in Eastern regions. And for per kilogram of carcass weight, it's 1,256 liters in Western regions compared to 148 liters in Eastern regions. Therefore, when it comes to making decisions about meeting net zero or biodiversity targets that include consideration of environmental impacts such as water use, as well as overall emissions, preference could very well likely be given to producers in areas of lower water stress that have better numbers. It's not just competition with Eastern Canada that you'll have to be concerned about. You'll also be competing with producers in the US and Mexico. Now, as you know, Canada is part of a North American trading bloc through the Canada-US-Mexico, formerly NAFTA trade agreement. The US is Canada's biggest trading partner. 78% of Canadian exports go to the US. 50% of our imports come from the US. Mexico is our number 5 export partner, number 3 for imports. So what are our trading partners doing? Well, at the same time that these standards were being developed, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, drafted its own climate rule. They were released on March 6th, and it was immediately litigated. Like, seriously, within a couple of hours, there were court cases filed. The SEC has stayed the rules indefinitely until those court cases have been settled. But even if the courts rule in favor of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC rules do not require Scope 3 emissions accounting. Climate scenario analysis is voluntary. There's no mandatory water risk assessment because industry-based guidelines are voluntary. Transition plans are voluntary, and there are safe harbor provisions that will lower legal and liability costs. And those are among some of the biggest costs of compliance for larger entities, which the Americans won't have to do. Now, some will say there's no need to slow down or pause or reconsider the formalization of the Canadian standards because they're just voluntary. But as I've shown earlier, they're very likely to be mandatory rather quickly. However, the standards being considered in Canada at the moment are so significantly different from the American ones that once mandatory, companies operating in Canada will be put at a competitive disadvantage in accessing the American market. And what about Mexico? Well, a few weeks ago, Mexico announced the adoption of a significantly scaled-down version of the ISSB standards, and at the moment they seem to be voluntary. It appears that only basic sustainability information is being requested. Scope 3 emissions accounting, industry-based standards, scenario analysis are not currently included. Mexican food producers will not have this added financial or regulatory burden, which will put Canadian producers, again, at a competitive disadvantage. For example, there was a 21% increase in Mexican beef and veal imports into Canada last year. Given that supermarkets are being pressured to lower prices, they're looking for cheaper products. Can Saskatchewan stock growers compete with the United States and Mexico with these new rules? I don't know, but it's a good and reasonable question that ought to be considered and put forward to the CSSB. So the CSSB standards, if adopted, will align Canada actually more with the European Union, which is only 8% of Canada's export market. It will make every business decision centered around climate rather than profitability. It will discriminate in some ways against Western Canadian stock growers through the water risk requirement, and perhaps most significantly, it will be non-aligned with the United States, which will likely put Canadian entities at a competitive disadvantage with our trading partners. So what can you do to shape these standards? Well, the first thing is to comment on them. Although it might be too late for individuals this round, it's my understanding that Garner and the SSGA have submitted comments, and there will be another chance to comment once the securities regulators issue their versions next year. In the meantime, there's a few takeaways or lessons from the failure of the oil and gas industry to adequately respond to what's been happening to them that I'd like to share with you. These lessons can help inform you for shaping the standards in the next round. So I would say the first lesson is to understand what and who you're up against and take them seriously. The traditional response of the petroleum industry has been to reach some kind of compromise, to find some common ground, even when the draft policies were extreme. The goal was to participate in or cooperate with the framing of the issue in order to hopefully influence the process, diminish attacks, and reduce bad press. And let me tell you, this strategy wasn't very successful. In fact, it emboldened environmental groups, and the petroleum industry is demonized for lobbying to prevent government policy changes that damages their ability to operate. Just do a Google search for Environmental Defense's lobby bot, and you'll see what I mean. The lesson here is that a seat at the table means very little when the outcome has already been decided. Be wary of who's sitting at that table. Not every group that claims to care about livestock or farming ought to be included at parity with your representation. The second lesson is beware of moving goalposts. Let's take net zero, for example. Canadians were told the energy transition was about being net zero emissions by 2050. But the technology to get there isn't ready yet. Nevertheless, stringent targets are being set now for 2030 instead of 2050. The oil and gas industry agreed it would work on reducing emissions intensity in production. But then the activists said that wasn't enough. And government agreed and said a company would have to account for and be responsible for all the emissions in their everyday operations, things they can control. And if they emit too much, they have to pay for it. That too wasn't enough, and now the government wants to put an emissions cap on the industry. At the same time, the accounting of emissions is being changed. So now instead of reporting on emissions the company can control, the government is being pressured by activists to report all the emissions and be responsible for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. These standards will help make that a reality. This means that an oil and gas company will have to account for emissions from people using their product. That means you driving your half-ton and your tractor, an oil and gas company will have to account for that. They will also have to account for the emissions embedded in their reserves, in the reserves of the oil and gas. That's the oil and gas that's still in the ground. They have to account for that with these rules. So related to the moving goalposts is the double-edged sword of data analytics, the obsession with technology to measure everything and accumulate as much data as possible, and then convincing you it's about accuracy and fairness. Now, there are some real benefits to certain kinds of data. It can help make your operations more efficient, take better care of your livestock. But then there's other data that's meant to hang around your neck like an albatross, and that is emissions data. As Terence Keeley, a former managing director of global asset manager BlackRock, warned the Canadian Senate Parliamentary Committee a few weeks ago, he said data itself isn't the issue. The big issue is how that data is being used. What are you doing with it? So what is the goal of collecting all this data? Supposedly, it's to help nations meet their net zero targets for fighting climate change. But how exactly? Reducing emissions means using less of high-emitting things, like hydrocarbon energy, like meat. Will monitoring everyone's emissions actually solve the problem of bad weather? Will it mean less tornadoes or thunderstorms? What are the consequences for everyday operations to be monitored continuously? What about privacy and freedom? Consideration of these questions seem to be missing from this discussion. And what I have here on the slide are some sample eco-label ratings for meat that they want to roll out in the European Union, where on the little package of hamburger meat or your steak, they'll show how eco-friendly or how sustainable it is based on emissions. And you'll notice that the one on the right, it's showing really far red, that it's bad. So the most important lesson to take away here is the importance of communicating what you do and the benefits of it. Communicate like your life depends on it, because it does. And speak out now before you may not be allowed to. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? Maybe you've seen some of the Pathways Alliance advertisements about what they're doing to try and lower emissions as part of their transition plan to meet net zero targets. Well, Greenpeace led a complaint to the Competition Bureau and the Advertising Standards Council, accusing Pathways of greenwashing and misleading the public. Greenpeace said it was misleading for Pathways to only talk about their direct emissions, and argued that Pathways, when they're talking about their transition, has to count all the emissions, even the ones that are out of their control, like the emissions involved in refining, transportation, and how people use their product. There hasn't been a ruling from the Competition Bureau yet. But the Liberal NDP coalition in Ottawa couldn't wait for the ruling and added into Bill C-59 2 weeks ago, after it had been voted on, 2 paragraphs that you can see here that will effectively ban oil and gas companies from speaking favorably about their future plans for progress on emission reductions. It would ban Pathways from communicating to people about their plans. And the wording is so vague, it means it could apply to any group talking about their emissions reduction plans and transition plans, livestock producers as well. So to date, what really helped the oil and gas industry was when supportive voices spoke up for the industry, like the grassroots organization Canada Action. They came up with the I Heart Oil and Gas stickers, t-shirts that you've probably seen around. And it may seem old-fashioned, but t-shirts, stickers, billboards, and bus ads have an impact on people. It sinks into their subconscious. There's a reason why brands like to have their logos on t-shirts. It's also really important to talk about trade-offs. The oil and gas industry did not respond effectively to the negative campaign against it, which still dominates in net zero discussions. All the discussions are focused on the perceived costs of using oil and gas, and there needs to be a conversation about the benefits. So agriculture and stock growers are perhaps better situated to discuss the benefits of farming and ranching, talking about the landscape and stewardship. Unfortunately, in certain circles, that voice has been dominated by the negatives: soil degradation, nitrogen crisis, methane emissions, and so on. And please be mindful of understanding how the standard setters, how the government officials, and how the activists see you. They see you as your cow emitting all this stuff that's killing the planet, versus how you see yourselves. You see yourselves as caring about the environment, caring about the soil, trying to do the best for your herd and for helping feed our country. Now, the government is very susceptible to being influenced by loud opinion and protest. And to be clear, there's a double standard. The environmental protests have an edge with the Liberal NDP coalition, since they're in alignment for the same outcome and they're treated differently. Nevertheless, loud grassroots voices can make a real difference, at what we just saw in Europe. Look what happened in Holland when the farmers got together. The government fell, farmers were elected, and now they're part of a governing coalition. It's possible to shape the CSSB standards to try to mitigate the worst effects for you and your livelihoods. The Scope 3 emissions accounting, the water risk, competitive disadvantage. But in order to shape those standards, it's important to know who and what you're up against. Going along to get along, trying to find common ground, can sometimes be a losing strategy, as much as you may want to try and figure out a way forward. And you know what? It's okay, and in fact necessary, to just say no to some of these things. Understand that the goalposts will move until the goal is reached, which is zero emissions, and watch out for the bait and switch. I can't overstate the importance of communicating what you do and the benefits of it. You have an amazing story to tell. Find the time to share it, publicize it, and encourage others to do so too. There's hope, and I have confidence in your strength and willingness to stand up for your livelihoods and way of life. And I know that in the end, you will make a difference. Thank you.
Before I shoo Tammy off the stage, does anyone have any questions for her? We have a few extra minutes before our coffee break if anyone does have any questions.
Hi, I'm Ryan Bayerback. I ranch at Whitewood, Saskatchewan. So when we see all the, I guess, reporting coming forward, to me it looks like in a lot of cases it's companies that want to promote themselves or have signed on to these net zero because they want to show that they're a good corporate citizen, or that increase shareholder value because they're showing they have a lower environmental risk. Do you think that this is driven by government regulation, or is this driven by corporations wanting to give what, say, an investor like BlackRock would require of a company that they're buying shares of?
That's a really great question. I think it's a bit of a, they're amplifying each other. So you have the asset managers who are actually ones driving it. The Brookfields, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Vanguards, even like the banking asset manager wings, they're the ones who are really pushing this. And one of the things that Mark Carney said at the Senate probably about 4 weeks ago, he was talking about a different bill, and he kept talking about these standards and how important it was, because there's $143 trillion in the asset management space that is just waiting for this data so they can shift investment. So the asset managers are driving this because they want a simplified way to get every company's emissions profile in order to shift the investment in that way. The big corporations like JBS and Cargill or whatever, these asset managers invest in them. And those investors are saying, well, we want this data so that we can shift all of this investment money appropriately. And we'll pull out our investment money if you don't provide us with these numbers. And then they're sort of in bed with the regulators to say, well, we need a more baseline so that everybody's reporting the same information so that the asset managers have that data, which is the same for every company. And one of the other things that Mark Carney talked about was when I talked to the securities administrators, they said they were not going to make it digital and that they were really worried about confidentiality and privacy. But Mark Carney was insisting that Canada sign up to the Net Zero Data Public Utility, which is run by the United Nations, where all of that data would be put in one place so that the asset managers could just go to that database, they could click a few things, and voila, they could shift the money the way they want. So it's the asset managers driving it, who then talk to the politicians, who suggest to the regulators that they all want this, and then the companies kind of have to go along, or then what do they do if they lose their investors? So I hope
So when you look at a stock profile and they give you your dividends and kind of what their rating is, just about all of them have an ESG rating already. Where does that number come from now if they don't have any standards?
So the ESG ratings are awful. I think there's something like 600 different rating agencies. They all use different methodologies. There'll be different categories, and they'll weight things differently. And I have tried to dig. They say our methodology's open. No, it isn't. I've gone through. I've had other people go through, data people, economists, and say, can you help me with this? Because how are they calculating these things? How are they weighting? How are they coming up to that determination? And it's very opaque. And so you'll get some ESG raters who, for example, will rate a tobacco company very high because they're actually doing sustainable things, and then another company will weight moral elements higher, so then the tobacco company gets a D rating. So it all depends on how things are weighted. Now, where do they get that information from? From the voluntary disclosures. So the Carbon Disclosure Project will often invite companies to fill out their questionnaire. For an oil and gas company like, for example, Canadian Natural Resources, it's 161 pages. 161 pages of explaining what you're doing, what your transition plan is, what your emissions are, and all this kind of stuff. And then CDP will rate it, and their methodology is opaque. I know an oil services company in Calgary, they were invited to do the questionnaire. They said, we don't have the money and time to do your questionnaire. And they got an F because they refused to do it. So it's kind of like if you don't comply, they're going to fail you. And if you do comply, you're probably going to get a bad grade anyway because of how they do their weightings and methodology. So what Europe is doing is they're looking to standardize how the ESG raters rate companies. I don't know how that will be any better, because ultimately it should be up to the investors deciding what elements are more appropriate for their investment profile than this other data.
Okay, thanks.
Emo from Pambrin. Just a quick comment and then a question. I think I speak for a lot of us here probably that nothing you have said today has diminished my rapidly rising cynicism. Sorry. But the question I have, this is a legislative thing also. Do you see any hope that a change of government would be able to reverse some of this stuff? And I understand that bureaucracies really do wield the power, and the elected officials who put them there don't seem to compete very well. But what do you think?
That's a very good question. One of the reasons why they're trying to put this through the securities administrators is that they're technically arm's length from government. So if the securities administrators decide that this is in the best interests of publicly listed companies, then that's what they will adopt. I think one of the reasons why there's been some hesitancy to adopt these in Canada is we're looking to see what the United States is doing. Because like I pointed out, if the United States doesn't do anything remotely strong like we're doing, we're screwed. We're screwed. It doesn't work. And so when I was talking to the securities administrators, they were really concerned about the competitive disadvantage, how this information that is being required from all of the different companies and everybody along the supply chain, how do you keep that confidential? Because there's ways that bad actors can undermine a supply chain once they have all that information. And if you make all that information public, then anybody can see it. Right now when it's a voluntary sustainability report, it's quite general to some extent because they're not disclosing a lot of things about their supply chain. But this would mandate opening up what the supply chain is doing and whatnot. And so there's different problems with that. Could the regulators then take a signal from what the elected government would prefer to do? Absolutely. Is there ways that legislation could be introduced to basically say, to undermine some of this stuff? Yes. But you would need a government that is aware of the problem and thinking about ways to legislate things in order to benefit Canadian producers and companies.
Yeah, my name is Glenn Snyder. I have a question for you in regards to the USDA has done some work in terms of the agricultural total factor productivity index and the impact that some of these legislative changes, particularly in greenhouse gases, has had on agriculture. So I'm wondering if there's anything like that that's been developed here in Canada or Western Canada.
That's a great question. I don't know. I haven't seen anything, and it hasn't come up on my radar as part of the information base, so I'm sorry, I don't know.
Some of the data that's been put together, some of the historical data, shows that in the past, from 2010 to 2020, since some of this legislation has come in, the productivity index has dropped. So I guess what I'm getting at is if in fact this legislation does come in, then we need tools in terms to measure it so we can counter-react it if we have to, type thing. If we look at the oil and gas industry, what is done there, and they're ahead of the curve on this, like you've indicated. My son is quite involved in Calgary on this, And what it's done, in a nutshell, is driven investment totally out of the oil and gas industry. And they're looking at, the longer term when they do their budgets, is that the price to the consumer isn't going to go down anytime soon simply because of this. So, there's that impact as well in terms of food prices, and then that cascades all the way through to the supermarket and high prices and so on and so forth. But anyways, I was just wondering if there was a TPI index that we have. So if we don't have one, maybe, something that we should possibly consider. So.
Yeah, for sure. And this is the big complaint, is that there hasn't been an impact analysis. There hasn't been a cost-benefit analysis. When that was asked, the CSSB said, well, look at what Australia did, because they did an impact analysis. And the costs of compliance and whatnot are staggering, what they would predict. And the problem for a livestock grower, or for even an oil and gas producer, is that you're price takers. So, you as a producer may have to comply with all this different stuff, but you can't, how do you recoup that? You can't recoup it. JBS or those guys, maybe they can recoup some of that because of how they do their deals with the larger grocery chains or whatever. But it ends up falling on you, right? Because it's not like you can demand, well, I need to increase the price of my cattle by X percentage, because you're asking me to monitor all of this different stuff and to hire a verifier, an auditor. And that's another issue, is auditing. How do you audit this information? I know that the Canadian Roundtable, with their estimate, that would be, you wouldn't need to audit that number. But the problem is that they will want to have a better number every year. And so, yeah, it becomes an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. If you can give her a round of applause.